So today, Azal Kutsia is facilitating, and thank you to all our speakers who are so kindly giving of their time. Okay, Azal, over to you. You're on mute.
Sorry. It still happens. In our world today, feminism is kind of is fashionable in a way that it's never been. I mean, all the tote bags, the future is intersectional, the future is feminist. We buy it. It's something we wear, and that has a certain kind of social capital to it. But of course, globally, but also in a place like South Africa, it is feminism had to start from a really different place and still needs to do a lot of work that is much different from that. So today we have speakers from different generations reflecting on this problematic of how we consolidate or think together or separate the kind of commodified versions of feminism, which is also, I mean, it is also good that feminism is in the mainstream in the way it is. I mean, that does something too. So it's a very interesting problematic that we will be discussing with a range of amazing speakers today. We are so excited to have brought everyone together. Nontle cannot be here. She is ill, unfortunately, but at least we have 4 others. So we will start with Shamim Mir. She's a feminist activist, researcher, and writer. She was a co-founder of the publication Speak and Agenda in the 1980s when she worked alongside working class women in community organizations and trade unions in the context of the struggles against apartheid. Since 1994, she has worked with organizations addressing land rights, the rights of women workers, and violence against women, among other social justice issues. And she has written extensively on all of this. Okay, you can take it away, Shamim. Thank you. And the rest of us, I think we can switch off our cameras so that we have Shamim big on screen. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'm really pleased to be part of this very exciting series and really honored to be part of this panel. I want to start by sharing my own feminist journey and how my ideas of feminism were shaped by the struggles of my times and in relation to the women I interacted with in trade unions and working class communities. But before I do this, a note that many kinds of feminism exist and have existed. And feminists seem to get drawn to particular strands of feminism based on their experiences, understandings, and their visions of the world they want to build and be part of. Our first issue of Agenda, a publication I was one of the founders of in 1987, dealt with the different kinds of feminism in an article with the title, "What is Feminism and What Kind of Feminist Am I?" This is perhaps still a pertinent question these many decades later. The many feminisms include liberal feminism, radical feminism, Marxist feminism, socialist feminism, Black feminism, third world feminism, lesbian feminism, and today we could also add intersectional feminism, abolition feminism, and ecofeminism to this list. I was among a group of feminists who drew a line between ourselves and liberal feminists. As we understood it, liberal feminists supported the capitalist system, and the struggle for liberal feminists was for equal rights to exploit and oppress the working class and third world in much the same ways as their men did. For us, capitalism was the cause of many of the problems in our country and across the world. Our feminism incorporated Marxist, socialist, radical, Black, and third world feminisms. We wanted to create a world free from economic, racial, and patriarchal domination and oppression. We wanted freedom in the home, in our communities, in the country, and globally. And at times, this meant challenging the men we loved and the men who were our comrades. men who saw racial domination and sometimes saw class exploitation, but who were blind to the ravages of patriarchy. We were a group of professionals and students who saw our place in the struggle as supporting working class organization. We were crucially aware that powerful oppressors never give up their power to oppress, and that change would only happen through organization and resistance from below. We worked with women in working class communities and with women in trade unions to support the building of working class women's power. Our feminism was grounded by this work. I came to community organizing through student activism in the context of the Black consciousness movement. In 1972, I was involved in student resistance at the University of Durban-Westville, resistance which had taken off across the country's Black universities and led by SASO. The following year, in protest against these expulsions and barring of students from the university, I continued social work studies long distance with UNISA while working as an unqualified social worker by day and being involved when time would allow in a community project, a preschool literacy classes and a grocery bulk buying project started by a group of activists in Merebank, Wentworth.
Shamim, can I just interrupt you there? Can the person whose camera is on and moving around, please switch your camera off?
Can I continue?
Continue.
Okay, thanks. So I was involved in this community project in Merebank, Wentworth, which were so-called Indian and colored communities. This community organizing was inspired by a SASO call that students should work in communities and by the Black community programs, which had started community projects following the mass exodus of students from Black universities, bush campuses as we call them, following the 1972 student resistance. My involvement with women through social work and community organization made me aware of women's experiences and of women's strength in holding together families and communities. I began to develop a feminist consciousness by the late 1970s. In 1978, I worked as a social worker in the Phoenix Township by day, while working with community activists taking up struggles around housing after work and over weekends. Like the work in Merebank Wentworth, the work in Phoenix linked day-to-day struggles with struggles against apartheid. The male comrades had brought in a group of us women to work with women in communities engaged in the housing struggle, Phoenix being just one of the many working class communities that had come together in the Durban Housing Action Committee to take up struggles of African, colored, and Indian working class communities. Our task as women activists was to meet with women and encourage their involvement in this race and class struggle. However, as the women from these working class communities came together and shared their experiences, it became clear that there were many issues in their lives that were not being addressed in these struggles led by the male community or male-led community organizations. Women were engaged in inspiring actions to address these issues, but these actions were taken for granted, they were overlooked, and they were not seen as particularly important. Not only were now women becoming a part of the housing struggle, they were also starting to raise these new issues within these struggles, issues that, as I said, were not seen as the stuff of struggle. Our male comrades had not expected this, and there were murmurs from them that the primary contradiction was national liberation, that raising women's issues was a diversion from this primary contradiction and was divisive. Yet we persisted. The sharing of experiences among women seemed important. However, it was difficult to arrange meetings across townships in those days, given apartheid spatial distances across race groups and a bus transport system into and out of townships intended only to get Black people to and from work. So in order to share experiences more often and more broadly, we started a newsletter that was to broaden out with the involvement of women in trade unions and the growing community organizations across the country in the magazine Speak. We were not working class women, the group of women who started Speak. However, we saw our role as supporting Black working class women in their struggles, and we tried as much as possible to do so without imposing. We wanted the magazine to be a vehicle for women to speak to each other about the things that were important to them and about the issues they were organizing around. We had hoped women would write for the magazine, but reluctantly accepted the more realistic option of speaking with women, recording their words as faithfully as possible, bringing back copy to them before publishing so as to get their agreement. The first issues were in isiZulu and English. The language used was as close to how people spoke, in other words, clear language, and we used lots of photographs so as to make for attractive, interesting, easy reading. We learned of an organic feminism among the women we met in community organizations and trade unions. These women may not have heard the word feminism, but they knew of and shared experiences of women's oppression and exploitation and their struggles to overcome this. Their lives, experiences, and understandings challenged the ideas that feminism was an export from the West or a bourgeois concern. Women workers told us of how learning of oppression in the factory got them to interrogate oppression at home. We learned at work how the bosses oppress and exploit us, they said. We then realized we are also oppressed by our husbands and that this must also change. While working with Speak on a book, No Turning Back, a woman worker leader shared her experience with a boyfriend who cared only for his own sexual satisfaction and who saw her as catering to his sexual needs and how she reacted to this. Her experience was captured as a story in Speak with the title As Proud as a Peacock. When Speak covered the issue of domestic violence, male trade union members told us, no, 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 these issues must stay in the bedroom. We were challenging the divide between the private and the public, bringing so-called private issues into public notice. We began to see the magazine as a vehicle for bringing a more conscious understanding within the struggles of the time that sexism had to be addressed alongside race and class. We wrote on issues that none of the other alternative media covered, such as domestic violence, rape, women's bodies, abortion, lobola, women's rights to sexual pleasure. When the OK Bazaar workers went on strike, Speak was the only one of the alternate media to write that the workers were women and what it meant for them as women to be involved in the strike. We heard of husbands not wanting women to attend strike meetings, of one husband who refused that his wife should be on a national strike committee. By 1987, I was part of the founding group of women who started Agenda so as to reach activists and academics around issues of women and gender. Since the alternative media tended to be blind, gender blind and marginalized women, this went for the alternative newspaper New Nation also. When a comrade suggested that they carry an article on women, the editor at the time said, but it is not Women's Day. As I've tried to outline, my understanding was shaped by various strands of feminism, was intersectional, embraced the personal as political, but also held a deep conviction that change can only come from building power from below, that change never comes from the powerful giving up their power. This idea is very different from opportunistic and vanguardist responses by leadership elites to the working masses, bussing them in or treating them as a tap to turn on and off to show they have mass support. In the early 1990s, as leaders of formerly banned liberation movements returned from exile and as they prepared for negotiations, our liberation leaders saw little use for mass-based people's organization. Voices from below had no role in the negotiations. This was a time for leaders, except when the leaders needed to make a show of power. They then brought out the masses into the streets in a show of strength. As a community and trade union feminist activist, it seemed I had no role in this scenario. And in 1992, I chose to study full-time for a master's degree in a bid to reskill for the tasks that lay ahead as we moved to the post-apartheid South Africa. The post-1994 era were years of demobilization of movements when seemingly we had moved from struggle to negotiations to development as if the struggle was over. But the struggle was not over, and there was perhaps even a greater need to continue building power from below. Ideas that had fueled the liberation struggle began to be watered down. Strong ideas of women's liberation were replaced by gender, understood in technical, depoliticized ways. NGOs, which had been service organizations supporting working class organizations in communities and factories, began to become delivery agents of the new state. These were also years when neoliberal ideas came to dominate our landscape, making redistribution less of a possibility. Post-1994, I have tried to bring ideas of struggle, power, and politics to my work with NGOs through training, research, writing, and organizational strengthening. Since 2010, I've coached working class community activists in writing on their own experience, and such writing, I believe, can play a role in creating knowledge, in challenging the mental manual divide that so many still believe in, and in challenging who produces knowledge and how. Today, links across class are crucially important, as much as they were when SASO students saw the need in the 1970s to make links with working class communities. I believe, as Nancy Fraser puts it, that the struggles we need to engage in are struggles for both recognition and redistribution, that struggles around culture, identity, racism, patriarchy need to come together with struggles against the exploitative, extractive capitalist system. Our struggles are of necessity, struggles over meanings, and around the distribution of wealth and resources such as housing, land, education, food, and the ability to shape and control one's own destiny. I believe there is much work to do in enabling critical thinking and the ability to express voice through writing and other means as part of the ongoing work of building power from below, so as to hold those in power accountable and to forever work for change so that the majority may live lives they value.
Thank you so much, Shamim. That was so interesting and rich, and I'm looking forward to that we can unpack it in the conversation. Next up, we have Sipokazintati Dlakavu, who is a lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria. Her area of focus is gender studies, social movements, and the ways in which African feminist activists make claims towards the state and organize politically. She has published widely. You can find her writing in Agenda and in Imbiza. She has written book chapters, opinion articles in media platforms such as City Press. She's a member of the South African Association for Political Studies and the African Feminist Initiative. She's well known as an African feminist activist, most distinguished for the stand she took in 2016 with 3 other young women in the Remember Kwezi silent protest when former President Jacob Zuma was delivering his live speech at the election center. So Sipokazintati, you can come up. I will signal you when you have 3 minutes left. And Shamim, you can switch off your camera, please. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really thankful for the space, and I'm honored to share a space with and speak alongside feminists I've admired and I'm inspired by. Pindi, Sipo, Shamim, I'm really grateful to share space with you. And Nonse, who could not join us sadly, whose activism in Kolobeni with the Amadiba Crisis Committee continues to inspire us all. So thank you to Nonse for her work, and I'm wishing her a speedy recovery. And thank you, Azil, for bringing us together today and all the work that you have done in the background. I'm really sad, actually, right now. I think this panel and this discussion is necessary for the economic crisis that we are facing globally, which is quite depressing. In South Africa, inflation, food inflation in particular, has risen to a 13-year high. The cost of bread, the cost of oil, milk, flour, has people not affording their basic needs. The food basket, the monthly food basket people need in this country to live, sustainable lives, most cannot afford. We have a poverty and a hunger crisis in this country, and it's truly saddening because it's not far from us, it's intimate. And it's truly scary how normalized it's become. And we know that inequality and poverty in this country have racialized and are gendered in nature. And so Black women in particular bear the brunt of inequality, of poverty, are the most economically precarious group. And so as we have this conversation, saddened by the reality that we are living in, with increased unemployment, increased hunger, and increased food inflation in particular. However, I'm really grateful that we are having this conversation and that we could think through ways in which we can organize politically against economic injustice. So for me, my inputs today are, first of all, I want to speak to the effects of being born, I think, in the 90s, and how capitalism ideologically has affected our thinking around issues of public services, our thinking even about the ambitions that we hold, as young people in this country. I have been affected by the rise in gold bossism, this idea that by working hard, by following the rules of capitalism, that you can attain a certain position in society, a certain comfort in society. But we know that this is a lie. We know that capitalism is built on a lie, and that in fact believing the growth model, the growth economic model leads to sustainability is a lie. And in fact, capitalism cannot end poverty. In fact, it facilitates poverty and inequality. We've seen this in democratic South Africa, where, as an Oxfam report shows us, that 3 white men own the same wealth as the bottom half of our population, and that inequality, I think the rich continue to get richer while the poor continue to get poorer. We've also seen the lie of capitalism in how it has commodified basic goods and services such as water, such as electricity and healthcare and education, and that and the effects of that, right, which then guaranteed that elite continue to prosper and the poor continue to remain in precarious and marginalized positions. And it's very saddening to see that, in post-independent Africa, politically independent Africa, we've seen the decline of the role of the state. We've seen how the moving slogans which mobilized people to fight in anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggles, ideas espoused around the belief that everyone deserved quality healthcare, quality education, an ability or the ability to make a livelihood through employment, etc. We've seen how the role of the state has been continuously been marginalized, and how we've seen that in our countries, various countries on the African continent, we've been told that the private sector and decreased state participation in the economy is what will lead us into a more prosperous societies. But we've seen how this is in fact, a lie, right? I'm not saying that, states in the continent, obviously through varying degree, have not failed their citizens in some way or another in terms of delivering public services. But I believe that corporations that are undemocratically elected, that are unaccountable, can lead to a more prosperous society is false. And so we need to then work harder to ensure that we start reinscribing the importance in the role of the state and in the role of the state in achieving socio-economic justice and prosperity for all, as feminists in this country mobilized for when they mobilized through the Women's National Coalition. The idea that the state can provide an environment to achieve socio-economic justice. So that's my first point, the idea of the role of the state and the decreasing role of the state that we have seen, and the increased austerity measures and policies where we've seen our governments investing less in healthcare, investing less in education, investing less in housing, and we've seen an increase in tax breaks for big businesses and corporations that do little investment and provide little investment to the people, of this country and even the wider continent. We know that, for instance, the continent, through the Mbeki high-level report on illicit financial flows, that Africa as a whole loses more money that it receives in aid or foreign investment. We lose our money through illicit financial flows, as well as through decreased tax on private corporations, right? We've seen, for instance, in this Ramaphosa administration, and how it continues to decrease business tax, and how it decreases the taxes of those who are the most elite in society. Yet that has increased. And we know the effects of that, especially now when we've seen increased food inflation. Although feminists have fought against the taxing of feminine products or menstrual products, such as pads and tampons, that's the fact that was allowed for the fact that was in place in relation to pads, in relation to tampons, that was a travesty. And I'm really grateful for the activism of feminist groups such as Amanda, Mobi, etc. Okay, so that is point number one. And another point I want to speak about is in relation to the activist movements that I have been a part of, particularly Fees Must Fall and outsourcing. And I think the failure, of our movement to link the crisis for decolonial and decommodified education to a wider, and a global crisis against capitalism and neoliberalism. So we know that, in the democratic era, the Mandela, Mbeki, Zuma, and Ramaphosa governments chose to follow a particular economic model. And we know that economic model has resulted in decreased public spending over the years. And that includes public spending in relation to higher education. However, I think in our movement, we fail to see how that decreased public spending in higher education was interconnected to wider struggles against privatization and austerity that affected all of us in relation to healthcare, in relation to electricity and water, etc. And the rise in private partnerships, public-private partnerships. And for instance, how institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, who continue to advise our governments and the role that they have had in that. And so the IMF and the World Bank advised our governments to decrease public spending. And that impacted public spending in higher education. And so when we campaign for fees to fall, our message should have not been only directed at our universities themselves, because our universities over the years have received decreased state subsidies and state support. And that started in the Mandela, government. Furthermore, our governments were advised by, global actors and institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank to decrease public spending in education, etc. And so when it's my appeal, I think, as we continuously engage in movements or struggles, that we make the links, not only in terms of our local context and the institutions that we are fighting against, but in terms of national policy and how global geopolitics affects that. And my last point, as I conclude, I want to speak about the effects. Sorry, someone. Please mute yourself. Okay. The effects of this economic crisis on, I think, my generation and the younger generation that I'm seeing right now. This young feminist, Uneo, I'm not going to butcher her surname, but I'll share the article she recently wrote. So she just wrote a very interesting article about the effects of the economic crisis, the global economic crisis on young women today, who are turning to a movement called, I think, hypergamy, or Black women in luxury, or the femininity movement that you can see popular on YouTube, on TikTok, and other social media platforms, where younger women are seeing the effects of this economic crisis and are seeing that their degrees, no matter how hard they work, they aren't achieving, economic stability in their lives. We know that this generation is poorer than the previous generation. This generation cannot even afford the houses that, their parents could afford, or the cars, or even children at this point. We are a generation that is having less children because we simply cannot afford to have them. And so what young women who are maybe not exposed to the history of various feminist movements are turning towards concepts such as hypergamy, or this idea of the femininity movement, the idea that how you look and how much you are desirable to men can elevate your economic status in life. So it's wanting to, I think, maybe marry rich, marry in a better economic class, because they are seeing that as a much more sustainable path than applying for jobs that simply don't exist. And so, which is saddening that young women are turning to these ideas, which are regressive, in fact, because of the economic precarity. Obviously, I believe sex work is real work. However, I also feel that people must not be forced into certain decisions because of the economic precarity, or because they don't have any other choice. And young people, are disillusioned, right? We are seeing the Great Resignation all over the world. We are seeing young people choosing to opt out of work because it's work that is undignified, or it's work that continues to put them in economically marginal positions. and it's work that doesn't care for their, I think, personhood, etc., etc. And so then what do we do? How do we move forward? And for me, obviously, I take, guidance from Pan-African or African feminists who are mobilizing throughout the continent and the global south against the effects of neoliberalism. African feminists such as feminists working with Feminist, who are calling, for just taxation of big corporates, who are calling for our governments to have tighter systems to ensure the end to illicit financial flows. And, people like Sipokazintati, who led, speaking later, who led campaigns, right, that showed us the amount, based on the amount of money we lose in South Africa a year through illicit financial flows, we can build a clinic in every village in South Africa. And so we need to then direct our energies at big corporations and our governments that promote, them plundering our nations and plundering our labor. And also we should just imagine a different economic outlook that does not prioritize growth over people, over collective good, and does not, prioritize this idea of individualism, but that is based on principles of economic solidarities and justice. Thank you.
Simamkele, thank you so much for that very thoughtful and powerful talk. I think there's so much to talk about and so much there. Thank you. Next up, we have Pindile. Are you in the room, Pindile? Yes, I see you. Okay, great. I'm so glad. We had some technical issues earlier. Let me quickly, so Pindile has over 10 years work experience in the social justice sector as an educator, communicator, researcher, and strategist. She cut her political teeth as an activist in the youth and student movement and proceeded to work with trade unions and activist organizations. She has strong academic interest in popular movements and struggles from below, neglected histories, as well as racial and gender justice. She has worked with different audiences to design learning programs that promote critical thinking, creativity, and imagination, peer learning, collective agency, and leadership development. Pindile is a curious thought leader and has contributed articles and commentary in different media and was featured in the 2018 film Freedom Isn't Free, the Freedom Charter Today. Okay, you can go. Thanks, Pindile. You are still on mute, so just unmute.
Azul, you're on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you now. Okay, great.
Okay, sorry about that. So I've got technical challenges. I'm logging in through my phone, but I hope it works out. Thank you for that warm introduction, and I must say that I'm quite inspired listening to all of you speak, and I'm also quite happy to be part of this panel because, many of the women who are part of this panel and who are also in the audience are women that I look up to, who inspired my early activism and whose works I read in great detail. Even when cynicism overcame me, I looked towards that work for inspiration and to sort of keep going. Thank you for that warm introduction, Azil. I usually like to introduce myself as a child of the working class who lived in different places, but who's always been located, or whose orientation has always been towards working class struggles. And I hope that's something that I keep even as I age and I grow older. But maybe let me just start off by, so when I received the invite for this chat, I thought, wow, there's a provocative question here about the class politics of feminism, but there's also a provocative question that leans on a number of keywords, such as depoliticization, such as commodification, and so on. So, I mean, I thought this is quite a provocative question. And then I started thinking about how does one respond to this question? And so my response leans on this idea of elite capture. And I want to talk about this idea of elite capture to sort of try and understand what's been happening in South Africa, but also what's been happening globally over the past 2-3 decades and even more than that. So my understanding of the idea of elite capture, which has resurfaced in academic circles, in social justice circles, through a new book that basically has the same title, which I won't name because I think that concept has been around in South African society and in South African activist circles for a long time. So, and the first meaning of it, or the first way that we talk about it, is how elites take over public goods and services and repurpose them for their own intentions and so on. The second aspect is about how elites take over processes that are supposed to be inclusive of the majority, or how they hijack processes and policies, so that in the end, it is their interests and their claims that sort of find expression. So many of us speak, or we usually speak about the elite capture of the transition from apartheid to democracy, and possibly it's that same elite capture that led passionate feminists to basically step back and to go into the academy, or to find breathing room in other spaces, right? We also speak about elite capture, for instance, of land reform. So we deploy this concept, this idea, to talk about a whole range of things. The third way, or the third understanding of elite capture, is also how elites sort of jump on the bandwagon of radical ideas, right? And how they co-opt these ideas, but in co-opting these ideas, they sort of prune the bits that are inconvenient, that are too radical, that unsettle them. So that in the end, these ideas are sort of removed from their radical intentions or their radical roots, and they are removed from being threats to the status quo. And it is this third understanding of how elites basically jump on the bandwagon of radical ideas and repurpose them for their own intentions. It is this third idea that I'd like for us to think about as we think about the questions posed in the blurb for this session and this conversation. Right, and in my use of this concept, I want to make the point that we cannot understand or answer the questions posed in the blurb without looking at how elites, whether it's big business, whether it's corporates, whether it's the wealthy and the upper middle classes, co-opt radical ideas, and how these ideas that are developed in the fire of struggle are used to rebrand, to sell commodities, and to win us over, and for brands to win us over to their newly found social consciousness. But they also do something that's quite important that Simamgele also touched on. They conscript our imagination about what is possible, about change and all of that, so that we buy into some of these ideas that, you know, the only way to change society is maybe to earn more money and be rich. I think it's Beyonce that says the best revenge is your paper, which I find quite interesting. And so in our context, I think there are different examples that actually appeal to young people, different examples of how this rebranding and this elite capture takes place. And I'll just refer to just two. There was one instance, South African local 2016, Puma's way of selling us its new apparel, which looked very cool, pretty, quite expensive, but their way of selling us this new apparel was to tell us that we must redefine the meaning of feminism. So Nomza Mombata entered the stage telling us that we are taking back the narrative of feminism. And this taking back of the narrative of feminism really was about doing you. So being you, being who you want to be, climbing high, and all sorts of messages like that. The second example comes from an activist who's perhaps closer to Simamkele's generation than mine, but it's an example that's taken from the Levi jeans advert and the campaign. And the campaign was basically about shaping your world. So it featured a whole range of women, of different hues, different countries in South Africa and beyond, who spoke about how they are actively shaping their different worlds, and they're rising above subordination, and they're rising above exploitation, and they're rising above a whole range of different forms of oppression, in a sense. So just those two examples, I think, for me, are important because they highlight a number of things, right? And some of the things that are highlighted, I might not attach a label to them, but I think Shamim spoke about liberal, individualized feminism and so on. But I think they're important because the first message that they tell us is that they promote the idea of the power of the individual, right? Whether it's the individual activist, the individual woman, the individual feminist, but this power of the individual who's able to challenge and rise above systems of oppression and exploitation on their own. Not so much about movements or the mass power from below that Shamim spoke about and so on, but it's really about the power of individual and investing in the power of the individual as a change maker. The second thing that they sort of push is, of course, I mean, the product or the commodity, whether it's a pair of nice sneakers or a pair of nice jeans that fit snugly and all of that, that the product or the commodity is important for reclaiming who we are and reclaiming our space. And obviously for me, I mean, it's quite problematic, but I think it's a demonstration of how some radical ideas get recruited, get co-opted, and get incorporated in the way corporates talk about their brands, and in the way that they try to sell us stuff, and in the way that they also try to sell us an image of themselves as socially conscious, without, of course, applying themselves to the systems that have made those ideas necessary in the first place. Okay, so, and I think this is not quite, I think it's not unique to feminism. And I think would be mistaken if we just reduce that to feminism. Although, I mean, the literature that I've read also points to the fact that because there are such different strands, and because the feminist tradition, feminism is a political tradition with many tributaries and many strands and all of that, that perhaps it's much easier to do that with feminism than with other ideas for social change. But I think it's just important to just pay attention to how brands and corporates actually do this. So for instance, we can look at how Unilever tries to sell us the language of climate justice, even though we know that it's one of the biggest polluters, and the products that they produce and sell are implicated in the crisis that we are facing today, let alone how they treat workers and so on. Another example is how the World Economic Forum, in its language, has actually incorporated some of the work that has been done by comrades like Sipo and at Oxfam, but also globally. The language of inequality, the language of the 1%, and so on and so on. So this is not unique to feminism. We've also seen how the Black radical tradition and the ideas that come from there are sometimes co-opted and used to talk about how, in the United States, for instance, they'll say the color of Black is green, which means money, the dollar, and so on. So I think that's important. I do want to make a disclaimer, though, that we shouldn't also create the impression that because there are these attempts at elite capture, to capture the language and to capture the radical politics of feminism, I don't want us to leave with the impression of thinking that there is no feminist organizing that is deeply political, that is rooted in working class struggles and communities in urban and rural areas, that takes on structural power of the state and of capital, and that organizes around everyday concerns, but also links them to broader systemic change. We know that this is happening, and there are many examples to think about. We can talk about Sisonke revolutionary movement in Orange Farm and in Soweto. We can talk about the women of Bontiville who are part of the broader movement that is fighting violence, that is fighting a draconian local state, drugs, and that who are experimenting with self-organizing from below and all of that. So lots of those things are happening. As I sort of try to draw to a close, I think for me it's important, before we respond to the question, how do we build a feminist politics that is rooted in class struggles, that takes on the structure of society, that puts questions of exploitation and so on at the center of struggle. I think it's important, though, to answer the question, or to pose and maybe try to answer the question, why and how did class politics fall out of favor in the first place? And I think for me, there are a range of reasons, right? And this question can also be posed differently by asking, why are left ideas marginal in society today? I think there are a couple of reasons, and I'll just go through them very quickly. And some of these reasons are not my own invention, but it's reasons that comrades such as Shamim, comrades such as Nancy Fraser, and feminists all over the world have sort of spoken about. So I'll speak about these reasons from my own experience, but also from the literature that I've been exposed to. I think the first one relates to the hardened attitudes of sexist men and their backlash against struggles waged and gains won by women in working class movements over time. So I don't know whether we call it a heteronormative backlash, and I think the class reductionism, this idea that the primary contradiction is the national contradiction, and how it's entangled with the class contradiction, and how gender is just some way very far from that. As an example, I mean, some of you might be shocked that even today, when you attend meetings of trade unions, or you try and do feminist workshops and all of those things, you will hear a lot of the men comrades saying, but comrades, gender is about men and women. It's not just about women, as a way of silencing some of the women's concerns, some of the demands, and as a way of just marginalizing gender and stripping it from its politics, and stripping it from its relationship to power, or as a power relation. So I think that's important. And I think that's part of the reason why younger comrades who are up and coming, who are also anti-capitalist, find some of these movements very unattractive and not accommodating. The second reason, I think, is the commitment of working class movements or like trade unions to an egalitarian social relations became exposed by insincerity, right? And this insincerity is about relegating the concerns that affect women primarily to the back burner, and in campaigns and so on, whether it's in bargaining with capitalists or the state. But this insincerity gets exposed as well by the masculine sexual entitlement that we've seen in the spaces where women are sexually exploited, in the places where women are sexually harassed, but also where they are relegated to subordinates in the organization, in administrative role, or making tea, cleaning, and basically being assistants to the male leadership. I also think that the victories in the increased representation of women in parliament is a double-edged sword, because the feminists of yesteryear found themselves justifying anti-working class, anti-women, and fundamentally regressive politics and economic policy, but also a social distance developed between the old leaders of the trade unions, women leaders of the trade unions, of the civics, and all of that, to the women who now were at the receiving end of the policies that were enacted by a democratic government. I think the fourth reason, as I conclude, is the deliberate neglect or loss of historical memory about struggles waged by women in the not so distant past. For instance, today we speak about intersectionality and the articulation of different forms of oppression. And we speak about intersectionality not only as a way of understanding these interlocking forms of oppression, but also as a way of including and as a way of understanding how different layers in society walk into struggle. And yet there are very few comrades, there are very few people, at least in my generation, who link that and go back to the ideas that were developed in the heat of the struggle. Ideas such as the idea that Black women are triply oppressed, or triple oppression of Black women. I'm not saying that that concept would still be applicable today, but I think for me it's a demonstration of the rich theorization that took place in the past, and theorization that was very linked to mass struggles and people's struggles against apartheid, against capitalism, against imperialism, and so forth. I also think that the working class in South Africa and the working class globally has been hammered and beaten to submission by the forces of capitalism, of neoliberal capitalism. I think the poverty, inequality, the joblessness, the deindustrialization, the privatization, the endemic violence that we see in our society today, which it's seemingly getting worse, has actually weakened the organizing capacity of the working class. It has not only changed the composition of the working class itself, but it has actually weakened the capacity of the working class to organize and to wage a fight back. And so I think that analysis, or that question, is important. How did class analysis fall out of favor? Or how did class politics get impacted over this time is quite important. When we come back, I'm done now, but when we come back, I'd like to talk about what I think are the building blocks of a feminism that is rooted in these politics, a feminism that takes neoliberal capitalism on, but a feminism that is also rooted in mass politics. I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to talk about how the local state and what's happening to the local state in South Africa is important for us thinking about the building blocks of a feminism that is rooted in class politics, that is rooted in anti-racist politics, that is rooted in politics that actually challenge the people who are in power in our society today, whether in the states, in the economy, and so on. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Penile, that was wonderful, and I absolutely love the phrasing that you use, that you say those in power have conscripted our imagination so that our idea of what is possible has become so limited. And I love how you phrase the question that you basically put in the center of this conversation, that also I think so clearly connects to what Simamkele and Shamim have been talking about. But why are left ideas so marginal at the moment, and why did class politics fall out of favor in our processes of movement building? So I think it connects so well so far. Thank you so much. Next up and last is Sipokazintati, who gave me a very short but powerful bio to read. She's a feminist activist who has been in the social justice space for 23 years. In that time, she's been in social movements, NGOs, and I see here INGOs, which I'm not even sure what it is or if I'm saying it correctly. But Sipokazi, you can go. I'll signal you when you have 3 minutes left.
Thank you, Azil. And yes, no, it's not important to know INGOs. There are more important things to know. But it means international non-governmental organizations. So, friends, I suddenly feel a sense of panic that, we are running out of time, because the thread of conversation has been so exciting, listening to all the feminists I've admired as an inheritor of feminist wealth that I'll talk about in a minute. And so many threads that would be really interesting to pick up. And so I guess no pressure on Azil, Amanda, and Sima, but like, this story is not finished, and so we shall have to talk about the mandate to to advance the conversation beyond this phase. And that's me being very serious, because I think when one listens to the previous dialogues and then what's already taken place here, there are so many important threads that I think could contribute towards this kind of reimagination of feminism that can sustain us all in a context where everything, is being taken away, including, as Pindi and others have alluded, this idea of like, our imagination. So no pressure, but I guess this is also by way of gratitude to the three of you who have convened this very important platform. And I do hope that, this won't be the end of it. So, I mean, Sima knows me. I'm a leech, and so it's been a privilege to be leeching on the three speakers who have spoken before. And, leechism, I guess, describes, I guess, pretty much how I've kind of come into feminism. So firstly, I think for me, when I think back to my own life and I think back to then the choices I've made about, what to put energy into as a kind of social and political agent, it would seem that feminism chose me when, it ensured I was born in a working class family from a mother who was a domestic worker, had to leave school at age 12, a family of what would be called peasants, farmers, healers, as I call them, anthropologists and sociologists, and all of these people who never set foot in school. And then, growing up in a family where it was all women running the family, and, a grandmother who was quite a powerful figure who took no nonsense, who taught us, I say in a chapter that I contributed to a book that a collective of feminists we did together. She was the first feminist I met. And when I, subsequently learned about, the language of that feminism, uses, even the word feminism, it was like, I was raised in a family, and by a woman who was a feminist in all of the ways that as I grow up, I admire more and more. And then, so having been born in that family, and like where every aspect of, South Africa's socio-economic and kind of political fabric was present, from the question of, how all the men either all went to go work in the mines, and then it was the women running and sustaining the village. And then I was always wondering as a child, but like, what is this, about? And then, like learning later about, the ways in which, women are, so-called, like they don't work, but actually the true extent and nature of work and the place and role of women in sustaining society, capacity to reproduce itself, which then later informed my passion and commitment and organizing around, work and feminist notions of work. So for me, it's something that came, from my own family, and, wasn't just a kind of an intellectual thing that, oh, that's interesting, so let me go do social reproductive work, and advocacy and activism. And then, growing up, into as a child of democracy, having been born a few years before democracy came, And then growing up in a South Africa where we were being told these stories of how beautiful life was going to be. But soon, being taught that dreams are good, but you've got to fight for dreams. And so the minute I landed, at varsity, having made it as a, a working class child who was probably the first in my kind of trajectory, family trajectory to actually go to university. And landing there and then meeting people like Mary Hames at UWC, who then taught me so much about and gave so much of meaning to the things that the question and answers to some of the questions I had held about. Why is this happening to Black women? Why are Black women always having to do this? Why are these men like talking about freedom only as it applies to them? Why is the, like democracy looking like this? Why are we arguing about numbers, when women did the work of liberating this nation? So, meeting those women and then learning about, all of these other women that I've come to love, admire, and rely on, the Prex Governors, Shamim, Mia, the Shireens. Hey, Shireen, I saw you log in. Bev Ditzi, who, remains one of my feminist inspirations. The Pumim Tetwas, and then learning about the work of feminists like Metal Vet Boy, who founded such.
Thank you.
Hi, Louise, do you want to? And then off video, yeah. And then work of women feminists like Metal Vet Boy, who founded the South African Domestic Workers Trade Union, that's been fighting a fierce battle in a patriarchal trade union federation and setup where women's issues, and women's kind of preoccupations were not important, and learning about, but Desiree Lewis's and other feminists, both within the academy, but also outside of the academy, learning from the women I've worked with in the social movements, I've been part of building, from, the working class women in the streets of Guguletu and Nyanga and everywhere else in the country, who taught me what it means to be a leader, let alone what it means to be a feminist leader. And so, there's the kind of list of women from whom I've inherited this wealth of like knowledge that is embodied about what, feminism means for me. But also, what feminism means as a kind of like a kind of a political project. And in many ways that has informed, not just who I am as a person, but also the kinds of lenses I've brought into spaces where, feminism taught me that you don't even have to use the name feminism, but you can do feminism. The pursuit, in my own work and the kinds of institutional experiments, that I've tried, failed, experimented again. But this idea that we can't ever stop pursuing, this project of liberation, and that even when it's painful. And it was interesting, thinking about this session and having this conversation with one of the young feminists who bamboozles me, because it's like she has very disruptive for my kind of understanding and frame, because I can be a little bit classical. but her ideas, as what she calls in part the lipstick feminist, and why she chose that, and like, what it means for people she, she's organizing with. And it's very interesting, I think, the experiments right now. And this is why, for me, I remain very excited about feminism. Because I think, unlike most movements, and in a way, this is why I believe feminism will continue to live long after, other movements have died and been buried, is that it's a movement that is self-reflexive. It's a movement that's not afraid of being in dialogue with itself. It's a movement that is therefore capable of continuously stretching the space of imagination, because it interrogates itself, it challenges itself, it asks the hard questions. And I think, this is, I guess, the fact that this dialogue is taking place is another, is one example of how, we are able to, kind of take on the analysis that is needed to look at how patriarchy is reinventing itself. And we are able to say, what, does our movement need to do at this moment? And we are able to find and repurpose, both old and new language, both old and new tactics, to kind of continue our advance. And yes, there are many things that are taking place in the space. I mean, I still remember, how in 1995, when feminists were busy planning for Beijing, a feminist I admire was already warning that, you know what, we're gonna go to Beijing, we're gonna win big and important victories. Patriarchy and, neoliberal capitalism is going to co-opt and appropriate not just some among us, but also the very content of, the demands that we are taking there. And so we should already be ready for the fight back to reclaim our language, to reclaim our intellectual, our intellectual capital, and to defend the demands. And so, what is happening now about how, what Pindi is talking about as capture is something that, we already knew would happen, in the ways that the story is written. And I think as a social movement person, I know very well how even we get written out of our own story, as women in movements, and how our contributions get eroded as a way to diminish the kind of feminist contribution. And I think the work now of saying, and my kind of, sorry, one more minute, I promise I'll conclude. My view is that we are at a very interesting kind of moment right now where, yes, we must do the work of like kind of thinking through what Pindi called the building blocks. But I'm hoping that the way we do that is going to, I guess, not, itself not be an elitist project which writes out the efforts and contributions and kind of victories of particularly working class women, because I think the danger remains that, yet again, this, kind of rebuilding of our movement that is necessary, ends up being an elite project, even as it intends to, I guess, act against that. Because my own work shows me that there's not a shortage of ideas that are coming from working class women. And I'm really sad that Nontle couldn't be with us today, but I'm very excited about what's possible as the kind of project from here that kind of takes the best from each of these trends, including the more liberal trends, because I think there's something there to use as seeds for our building blocks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sipokazi. I really liked how you approached the topic, almost refracted through your own personal feminist genealogy. And I also loved how you picked up on the generational differences and tensions that we've seen coming up in this conversation so far. I think let's get all the speakers on the screen again so that everyone is visible at the same, our 4 speakers are visible during the Q&A. And then I was thinking I should just also give credit to, so I was behind the more practical arrangements of this panel, but it was Simamkele who conceptualized this conversation. And I think she did it so well. And it just shows how urgent and important, and generative this kind of conversation can be. So thank you for that, Simamkele. Who are we missing? Shamim, can you also put on, are you still with us? I know she said she might have a power outage. Okay, great. Okay, we can have, you can either raise your hand if you have questions, or you can type it in the meeting chat. While people think of their questions, I wanted to ask Solange whether our speakers maybe have questions for one another. And if you have, you can just fire away. No? Yes, Simamkele, go.
Thank you, Azil, and thank you everyone for those amazing inputs. My question, I think I have 2 questions for the other speakers. One is about South Africans' isolation, I think, with the rest of the continent and our conversations around issues of economic justice and inequality. I know various, panelists here are involved in, continental-wide initiatives. I know that, but how do we just broaden these? Because I'm aware of the work that's being done by Feminist, and in particular, a lot of African feminists in East Africa around, the DEAD campaign, Stop the Bleeding, around illicit financial flows, and challenging the idea that corporations and private businesses must provide basic services to people like water. So how do we, I think Sipo spoke about this as we rebuild the feminist movement in this country, how do we then ensure that it is truly Pan-Africanist in its leaning, etc. And then my second, I think, question is around, and I wish Nontle was here for this, because I think she and other feminists, whether it's the rural women's movements or Amadiba, they are really I think leading this conversation around the idea of what is development and what development that is people-centered, that centers also the sustainability of our planet, what it would look like. And I think I'd like for us to discuss, what it would look at, what do you think it would look like, and how we could, I think, have more buy-in, from other people and the wider population in this new idea of development.
Who wants to respond? One of our speakers.
I'm happy to, I was gonna ask Shamim a question, so I do have a question. And it's not, I'm not being ageist, but I really do value, like the lessons of history. And I mean, like you've seen, feminisms, or as I like to talk about it, the feminist movement. And I know the whole concept of movement itself is problematic, but like I like what should we be taking forward from history, and what is our source of hope? Because I think, so I was just interested in your reflection on that. But I mean, on this theme, so I mean, as somebody who's navigated this development space on the one hand, and in that space, connected with fellow feminists who, held a critique of, the kind of whole development industrial complex, and how, like anything else, it's been co-opted, perverted, has nothing to do with development. It should, in fact, not be called development. And then engaging with feminists such as those who, are part of Femnet and others in other parts of the continent, and thinking about, these questions. So, and also, these dialogues about what does Pan-Africanism mean today, right? In a context where what neoliberalism has done is atomize us and pull us away from each other, make us very parochial and all of these things. And then the South African kind of dynamic of being connected, part of, and yet not part of, and like, all of our own kind of, challenges and hegemony issues. I mean, I think from a South African feminist standpoint, right, it starts with the lens. What is our understanding of the nature of the problem, right? Do we have a very kind of narrow parochial perspective? Do we have a systemic perspective of what the problems are, which would enable us, like enable an answer that makes it obvious that of course we've got to have a pan-Africanist perspective, we've got to have an internationalist perspective, because we've got to have a globalist critique of neoliberal capitalism. And so, like, it kind of becomes an obvious, but I think, for reasons we all know, there's a tendency to be quite parochial. But I remain encouraged by the efforts of feminists both here and elsewhere in this space to connect, to build a critique together that also kind of in the broader international space positions the issues of Africa and the continued neocolonialism. That means that today, we are having to fight for a new taxation regime, and we are having to make the demands that we are making, and often are alone in the international spaces. And so I guess my answer is that, the work that you are doing is very, very important for me, which is about, I guess, deepening this understanding of the internationalist nature of these problems, and how, if we are serious about making change, we can't just be thinking about the national. Is important, and so continue doing it, and I continue being committed to that. But I do think that it's about the lens, and then it's about making the connections. And then I guess the movement building aspect of it, I guess, is the challenge, because for this connection to be kind of material in terms of we're taking demands to these spaces, whether it's, and we are standing together in the international space, it needs coordination. We can kind of hold on to the idea, but without the kind of active coordination and movement building, it will remain a nice idea. But yeah, I agree with you. It's these, and I think the thing about rebuilding feminism for me is that it's got to deal with it can't just be an intellectual endeavor. It's got to deal with the kind of what does change look like if we have this critique about the neoliberal advance, and how it's working through our economies. Hence the work to try and say, what could it look like to reimagine our economies from a like a women's perspective, if we had to build an economy for women, forget everything else, this is what it could look like. And of course, you know, the class kind of lends into that. So I think there's a lot of initiatives going. I think sometimes the challenge is to bring these things together.
Shamim, I see you are speaking, but you are on mute.
Sorry, I'd like to respond to Sipo's question. It's a lovely question. The second part was, what is our source of hope? And I believe that's what we are looking for. We are looking for hope in a very dismal situation. Simamkele talked about the terrible economic crisis, right, that we're in. Pindile talked about the elite capture, and elite capture has happened at a number of levels. I mean, she mentioned land, and one of the papers I've been writing on recently was women's, you know, land reform and women today. It's something I've come back to after a number of years. I wrote on this previously from 1997 to about early 2000, and I'm now picked up on it again. And it was such a seemingly hopeless scenario that we are looking at, because this very elite capture has taken place. And so the land reforms moved completely away from, you know, serving the needs of poor landless people to creating commercial farmers. And so it's people who have business expertise are now the beneficiaries of land reform. And you know, so looking at what are the things we should be asking, a state that seems to be collapsing, failing, a party that is decimating itself, and as the ruling party, whatever happens in the party obviously affects the state. And in this scenario, what are some of the recommendations for advocacy even against this? You know, what can we expect from the state? So there are a whole lot of issues and questions around the mess we are in. As I listen to people, and I hear myself also talking about working with women in trade unions, in factories, in communities in the past, and looking at the situation today where there's jobless growth, where there's so very few people, women or workers in jobs, right? Because labor's become casualized. Production has become something that can happen without workers. And the workers that exist today, in fact, from the early 1990s, because of the bleeding of workers from the labor scenario, from factories, you've had the workers who built the trade unions, who built COSATU, no longer exist because there are so few mine workers, because many sectors have lost workers. And today they're the majority of workers are workers who are government employees, who are working in healthcare. So it's not the blue collar factory workers of the past we're talking about. So when we're talking about the working class today, we're talking essentially about the peasants who are still living off the land, women in the former homelands in particular. And so the whole ways of organizing that happened at the time I was talking about, and when I was involved, we're talking about the working class is is of a different nature and a different character. So we need, and of course, trade union organizations created a basis for the liberation movement in this country to organize, because people were in factories. It was possible to organize them factory to factory to factory. Today, the task is much more difficult. So we need to find new ways of doing this. And in painting the seemingly hopeless scenario of the state, I'm not saying there's nothing we can do. Obviously, there's stuff we have to do to hold accountable those in power to the needs and interests of the majority of the people in the country. And so I'm just painting more of the scenario rather than coming up with an answer to what we can actually do. But how we understand this is for me very important. And I just want to add, as Pindile has said, the problem is not just of feminists, but it's for the left in its entirety. The erosion of movements, the erosion of left ideas.
Amanda, I see you have come on screen. Do you think it's time for us to finish?
We are out of time. There are interesting questions in the chat box as well. But I think I see people are leaving, and I just want to, from my chair, thank those of you who have attended and who have attended all four the intergenerational dialogues. Thank you for your time. When we started this, we had no idea whether it would be successful or not. And I am so pleased to say that the attendance was amazing. The feedback was amazing. And Sipokazi, thank you for asking for a mandate to continue, because I think we need more of these conversations. Going back to 2015-16 with the fall list, many of those students were in my class, my gender class at that time. So I taught them, and I remember those amazing conversations we had in class, and I was thinking we need more of that. We need to actually have this intergenerational dialogues to understand what young women are thinking, young feminists. And so, we together with Simamkele and Azul, who did most of the work, they conceptualized it and they found the speakers. And I have to say, my networks are not so good, so I wouldn't have been able to find all these wonderful speakers we've seen here in the four dialogues. So thank you to those the speakers. Azul and Simamkele for your work behind the scenes, and also for Professor Debbie Bonnen, because this was a collaboration with the sociology department at the University of Pretoria. So thank you. I think that, it's clear that we talk about a history here that, and as Shamim, you've pointed out now how things have changed, right? The working class is something very different now. So we need to go back to the historical roots, but we also need to understand how this global context in which neoliberalism and war and continued exploitation and migration, how that impacts our thinking around feminism and feminist projects, and specifically movement building. I think, that is so important. And my research is also on movement building. So how do we, in these very dire conditions, do we build a movement, a local movement down to grassroots, but then transnational and even global? And I think we need to continue this conversation. So I don't know how we're going to do that. Do we want to do it in cyberspace? Do we do it somehow differently? But that's where we end for now. And thank you again for everybody who was involved, and I hope to see you soon in the future.